Hey gentlemen, welcome back to the garage. We're out here doing what I hope will be a pretty simple job, and that is to replace the garbage brake pads that came with my Ninja 250 here with these awesome sintered ones that should hopefully help balance out the feel of the brakes. Currently, the front brake feels pretty anemic in comparison with the rear, and that's no good. The front brake is the one that does most of the work, and if you're not having that feeling when you get on the brakes, something's wrong. And I suspect that what that is I've got good pads in the back and crummy ones in the front. So we're gonna swap those out this evening. Let's get to it. Our first order of business is to get this caliper off of the bike. These two bolts are the only things that hold it on, and they're both 12 millimeters. So we use our 12 millimeter socket and ratchet handle. The astute observer will note that these look like they've been removed before, and I suspect that the original pads have been replaced with cheap, crummy ones, as the original pads on these are supposed to be okay, but these seem pretty awful. Also interesting is that this top one was much tighter than this lower one, so we're going to see what's going on with that while we've got this apart. So you go ahead and you remove your two bolts, and your caliper should slide right off the disc. Our next step of the process is to get the pads out of the caliper. The inner one, this one here, the smaller of the two, is pretty easy. You just kind of unhook it from these tabs right here that stick out of the caliper bracket, and it pulls right out. The other one is trickier. What you do for this one is first move the caliper bracket, this piece, as far up against the caliper as you can get it. And then you slide one end as far that way as you can, and the other end as far this way as you can, until you can slip these ears off of the slide pins. You see that? Now I've got it out of there. Slip it over the pin, and it slides right off. You'll note that these are not worn out, but I hate the way that they break, so I'm replacing them. Next, we need to push the pistons back into the caliper. This caliper looks a little crusty, and under some conditions you could totally justify rebuilding it, but I don't happen to have the seals on hand, and I think it's probably okay, so I'm just going to reuse it as is for now. Before we compress the pistons in the brake caliper, we need to make sure that we're not going to overflow our master cylinder reservoir. So we need to remove the two screws that hold the cap on this. Remove the two screws here. Lift the cap off. Make sure you get your little rubber gasket seal thing with them. Set the cap aside. Be ready to scoop the excess fluid out of this. You can use a syringe, you can use paper towels to just soak it up if you have to. But I happen to have a turkey baster that I keep in the garage just for this purpose. So we'll just soak up a little bit of it here. There we go. That should have enough of the fluid out of there that we can compress the pistons without it overflowing and making a mess. Okay, now we're ready to compress our pistons and push them back into the caliper. So in order to do that, we take our old pad and we put it back in here. We take our C-clamp and we fit it around pad and caliper thusly. Get it as close as you can to the center, but it isn't hugely critical. And then just tighten the C-clamp down. And you'll see that your pistons retract back into the caliper. While you're doing this, you want to make sure that you keep an eye on your fluid up at the master cylinder to make sure that you're not overflowing, and just in case you didn't take enough out of there. We are doing just right. So you tighten the clamp till it doesn't go anymore. See, we've got our pistons pretty much fully compressed in there. And for good measure, we'll take the clamp off, put it on the other piston so that we make sure we got both. Thusly. There we go. Okay, with our pistons fully retracted back in there, it's okay for short periods of time to let the brake caliper dangle by the hose like this, especially if it's not a terribly heavy caliper. If this was a huge Brembo car brake caliper, you wouldn't want to let this happen. But especially with these rubber hoses and a caliper this small, this is totally fine. It'll be okay for the 10 minutes I need to have it apart. So now we take our new pads and we reinstall them in the reverse order that we disassembled the caliper. All right, so we got our new pads, and in basically the same order as we disassembled it, we reinstall them. So you get the outer one captive on the pins first. We get the inner one. Make sure you get the tab side in. Onto the two tabs inside the caliper there, just like that. And then we take our caliper, put it back on the rotor, and reinstall our two bolts. This part can be a little bit fiddly sometimes. You want to make sure you do these by hand before you tighten anything, because you want to make sure you get the holes in these lined up correctly so that you don't cross thread it. And there we go. So we tighten those down as far as we can. Then we use the wrench to get them snug. One ug. As I talked about in the Cush Drive shim video, if you wanted to, you could use a torque wrench on these and set them to the proper torque spec, but I've done enough of these to know what tight enough feels like, and one ug, one good on the wrench is good enough. This is pretty good. And now we just need to pull the lever a couple of times to make sure that the caliper seats properly so that we don't get out on the road and discover we have no brakes. When you can pull the lever and it doesn't go all the way back to the grip, you're good, and you've got your pads seated up against the rotor. Our last little bit of reassembly is to, one, make sure that we've got fluid in the reservoir, and two, make sure you reinstall the cap to the reservoir and tighten the two JIS screws that hold it on. They don't have to be terribly tight, just enough so that it's not gonna come flying off. And then make sure you wipe up any spilled brake fluid from up here, because it'll totally take the paint off your fairings in the tank. And that's it. We're all done. Now we need to take the bike for a ride. All right, I'm all suited up and ready to take the bike for a ride. I've got the pistons seated all the way up against the pads, but the lever still feels a little bit mushy. And the reason for that is that they're not fully broken in, and there's a little bit of play in that whole system. So part of the process of breaking pads in is to take up the play and wear pads to match the shape of the rotors, which if they're not new, aren't perfectly flat. So I'm gonna take the bike for a ride now. And then after that, basically you just take it easy for the next couple hundred miles, or the first couple laps if you're doing this on a track bike. EBC doesn't specify an explicit procedure for breaking these pads in. So I'm gonna do what they do say and just take it easy for the first couple hundred miles and make sure to use the brakes plenty. Hey guys, I'm back in the office and I'm ashamed to admit I ignored the low battery light on the camera, and as a result I lost the footage of the test ride after I changed the brake pads. So you're just gonna have to take my word for it that the brake pads worked after I changed them and that performance is better. The difference is kind of subtle. If you're not a fairly experienced rider, you might not notice. But as a rider with a reasonable level of experience, I can tell the difference, and I think it was worth the effort. So if you're looking to do this on your own bike, I hope this helped you out. If you came here for entertainment, I hope you were entertained, and I will see you in the next one.